They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They didn't check a single permit. One morning, I woke up to heavy machinery tearing apart the dam on my land, the same dam that had quietly held back floodwater for decades. The HOA called it unpaid fees. What they unleashed instead was a wall of water that erased their entire neighborhood from the map. If you believe in real justice, unstoppable karma, and watching raw power collapse under its own arrogance, subscribe now, because stories like this prove nature always collects its debt. The dam was not impressive to look at. It wasn't tall, dramatic, or engineered with concrete and steel. It was earth, stone, timber, and time. Built decades earlier, reinforced slowly, season by season, it sat across a narrow valley on my land and did exactly what it was supposed to do. It slowed water. It spread pressure. It prevented sudden release. I inherited the property with the dam already in place. County records documented it clearly. It wasn't a commercial structure. It wasn't decorative. It was a functional flood control feature designed to regulate seasonal runoff from higher elevations. Every spring it filled. Every summer it eased pressure downstream. Every fall it held just enough to keep everything stable. The HOA neighborhood came much later. Developers built downhill from my land, carving streets and houses into areas that had never existed before. Their blueprints assumed stability. What they didn't account for was that the stability came from something they didn't own: the dam. For years, there were no problems. The water behaved. The neighborhood stayed dry. The HOA collected dues, enforced rules, and slowly expanded its sense of authority. They treated the surrounding land like it existed to serve them. That confidence eventually reached my mailbox. The letter accused me of unpaid HOA fees. It cited maintenance assessments. It referenced shared infrastructure responsibilities. None of it applied to me. My land was outside the HOA. Always had been. The dam was not theirs. Never was. I responded with documentation, deeds, surveys, county records. I expected the issue to end there. Instead, it escalated. The next notice accused me of noncompliance. It claimed the dam posed a safety risk. It demanded immediate access for inspection and modification. The tone was not a request. It was an assumption of power. I denied access formally and in writing. That denial triggered their worst mistake. I was not home the morning the machinery arrived. A neighbor called first, voice tight with urgency, telling me trucks were on my land. Excavators, dump trucks, workers in reflective vests tearing into the dam's spillway. By the time I arrived, half of it was gone. Earth piled where it shouldn't be. Water surged faster than it ever had. The controlled, patient flow had turned aggressive, hungry, loud. The workers avoided eye contact. They claimed they were acting under HOA authorization. They said it was about unpaid fees and safety compliance. They had no court order, no permits, no right. I told them to stop. They didn't. They said the HOA had ordered full removal. That was when the water broke through. What had once been regulated pressure turned into momentum. The reservoir released in minutes what it normally released over weeks. The valley roared. The channel downstream widened violently, cutting new paths through soil that had never known force like that. I watched helplessly as the water surged downhill, straight toward the neighborhood. The workers panicked. Radios crackled. Someone finally shut the machines down, but it was already too late. You don't pause a flood once gravity takes over. Within an hour, emergency sirens echoed from below. Roads flooded first, then yards, then basements. Storm drains overwhelmed instantly. Water climbed steps, swallowed cars, and turned streets into rivers moving faster than people could run. The HOA's phones went silent. Residents screamed questions. Emergency crews scrambled. Insurance adjusters began arriving before the water even receded. And the dam, my dam, was gone. What the HOA didn't understand was that dams don't just hold water. They hold responsibility. And by destroying it without authority, they had transferred that responsibility directly onto themselves. As helicopters circled and floodwater claimed everything downhill, one truth became impossible to deny. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a decision. And the consequences were only beginning. The water did not slow once it left the valley. It accelerated, fed by gravity momentum, and decades of stored runoff suddenly released all at once. What had been a controlled system became a moving mass, loud enough to drown out sirens, powerful enough to carry debris like toys. Logs, stones, broken timber from the dam itself rode the surge downhill, smashing into culverts and choking drainage systems that were never designed for that volume. The first street flooded in minutes. Water climbed curbs, rushed across asphalt, and spilled into yards that had never seen more than shallow puddles. Lawns vanished under brown, churning water. Cars stalled where they sat, engines drowned before drivers could react. The current pressed against garage doors, forcing them inward, spilling into basements and living rooms with unstoppable force. Residents ran. Some fled on foot. Others tried to move vehicles, abandoning them when doors wouldn't open against the pressure. Emergency crews arrived fast, but not fast enough. Fire trucks parked at higher ground, lights flashing uselessly as water rushed past. Police blocked access roads, redirecting traffic away from the flood zone that was expanding by the minute. The HOA's leadership was nowhere to be seen. Their office phone rang unanswered. Emails bounced back unread. The same authority that had ordered heavy machinery onto my land had vanished the moment real responsibility appeared. In its absence, confusion spread faster than the water. Emergency management teams began coordinating evacuations. Residents were pulled from doorways. Elderly homeowners were assisted through chest-high water. Children clung to parents as they waded toward safety. The sound of alarms blended with shouting and the constant roar of water forcing its way through places it had never been allowed before. Downstream infrastructure failed next. Storm drains overflowed immediately, turning into fountains that fed the flood instead of draining it. Retention ponds breached their limits and merged into the flow, amplifying the surge. What had been designed as layered protection collapsed under pressure created by a single unauthorized act. By late afternoon, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Streets became channels. Yards became marsh. The water didn't just pass through. It lingered, filling low areas, settling where gravity told it to stay. Mud coated everything. Debris piled against fences and homes. The smell of wet earth and fuel hung thick in the air. News crews arrived as the sun dipped lower. Cameras captured aerial footage of a subdivision underwater. Roofs reflected in muddy currents. Reporters asked the same question everyone else was asking. What caused this? The initial explanation blamed heavy rainfall. It was an easy assumption, but it didn't hold. Weather records showed minimal precipitation. The timing didn't align, and residents began talking. They talked about the machines, about the dam, about how the flood started not with rain, but with destruction. By evening, emergency officials confirmed what the footage already suggested. The flood originated upstream, triggered by the sudden release of stored water. Investigators followed the path back to my land, where the remains of the dam lay torn open and useless. The narrative shifted immediately. This was no longer an act of nature. It was human action. County officials arrived after dark, flashlights sweeping across the broken structure, documenting damage, measuring flow paths, taking photographs. The questions came fast. Who ordered the work? Who authorized it? Where were the permits? No one had answers. The contractors admitted they acted under HOA direction. They showed emails, instructions, timelines. None of it included legal authority. None of it included emergency justification. It was about fees, about compliance, about power. That distinction mattered. Because once flooding is caused by unauthorized interference with water control structures, liability shifts sharply. Responsibility no longer belongs to the land or the weather. It belongs to the decision maker. The HOA's phones lit up overnight. Residents demanded answers. Insurance companies asked questions. Emergency managers requested documentation. Lawyers took notes. The association's leadership finally surfaced, issuing vague statements about unforeseen consequences and safety concerns. No one believed them. The water receded slowly over the next 2 days, leaving behind damage that couldn't be dismissed or repaired quickly. Basements were ruined. Foundations undermined. Electrical systems destroyed. Mold began forming almost immediately. Cars sat where they'd been abandoned, interiors filled with silt. Loss estimates climbed rapidly, and with them anger. Residents who had once trusted the HOA now demanded accountability. Meetings were called. Voices rose. Documents were requested. The decision to destroy the dam was no longer an internal matter. It was a community disaster. I stood on my land watching investigators work, the valley scarred where stability once lived. The dam was gone, and with it, the buffer that had protected everyone below. The silence that followed the flood felt heavy, broken only by distant machinery and the occasional shout from cleanup crews. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accident. It was a chain of choices made without authority, without knowledge, and without restraint. The flood had answered those choices clearly. By the end of the week, official reports began circulating. The dam had been functioning as designed. Its removal caused the surge. The HOA had no jurisdiction. No permits were filed. No emergency existed that justified immediate action. The conclusion was unavoidable. The HOA had created the disaster, and now every step forward would be shaped by that fact. The water had claimed the neighborhood. Next, the law would claim the people responsible. The shift from chaos to accountability happened faster than anyone expected. Floodwater may move quickly, but responsibility moves faster once damage is visible, documented, and undeniable. Within days of the water receding, the focus narrowed from what happened to who caused it. That distinction changed everything. County investigators returned with specialists not to assess damage, but to trace decisions. They reconstructed the sequence of events with precision. Emails were requested, meeting minutes reviewed, contractor invoices examined. Each document filled in a gap, and the gaps pointed in one direction. The dam had not failed. It had been destroyed. That difference carried legal weight. Structural failure could be argued. Natural erosion could be debated. But deliberate removal, without authorization, left no ambiguity. The act itself became the cause. Residents learned this in stages. At first, there was disbelief. Many had assumed the dam was temporary or unregulated. Some believed it was decorative, outdated, or even illegal. Those assumptions collapsed as records surfaced. The dam was documented. It was registered with the county. It was known. The HOA had known about it for years. That knowledge mattered. Investigators confirmed that the HOA board had discussed the dam in internal communications months earlier. They had identified it as a leverage point in a fee dispute. Language in those messages was careful but revealing. References to pressure and compliance appeared repeatedly. Safety concerns were mentioned only after access was denied. That sequence mattered too. Intent does not require malice. It requires awareness. The HOA was aware the dam existed, aware it regulated water, aware it was outside their jurisdiction, and they acted anyway. The contractor's statements reinforced the timeline. They described receiving instructions framed as urgent but not emergent. There was no mention of imminent danger, no directive from emergency services, no permit number provided. The work was scheduled, not reactive. Scheduled destruction. As investigators compiled their findings, residents began asking harder questions. Why had the HOA escalated to physical action instead of legal process? Why were no authorities consulted? Why were contractors allowed onto land the HOA did not own? The board struggled to answer. They released a statement acknowledging the dam's role, but minimizing their intent. They framed the action as a misunderstanding, a misguided attempt at compliance enforcement. They avoided the word destruction. They avoided responsibility. But language could not outrun evidence. Insurance companies entered the scene next, and their presence changed the tone immediately. Adjusters walked flooded homes, documented losses, and asked the same question every time. What caused the flood? When residents answered honestly, the answers aligned. The dam removal, the sudden surge, the timing. Insurers compared those accounts to weather data and found no contradiction. Claims were flagged, not denied, flagged. When flooding results from third-party negligence or unauthorized action, insurers pursue recovery. That recovery targets the party responsible. The HOA, already under scrutiny, now faced subrogation from dozens of directions. Legal notices followed quickly. Attorneys representing homeowners filed claims against the association. Emergency management agencies demanded reimbursement for response costs. Environmental regulators opened parallel inquiries into the destruction of a water control structure. The HOA's authority evaporated under the weight of consequence. Meetings became chaotic. Attendance surged. Residents demanded resignations. Board members sat silent as accusations filled the room. The sense of control the HOA once wielded was gone, replaced by fear and fragmentation. Several board members resigned within a week. Others hired private counsel. The association retained a law firm specializing in disaster liability, a move that confirmed what residents already suspected. This was no longer an internal dispute. It was a legal reckoning. County officials issued a formal determination linking the flood directly to the dam's removal. The document was technical, unemotional, and devastating. It cited hydrological models, flow rates, and structural analysis. It concluded that the dam had been functioning as designed and that its destruction caused downstream flooding. That determination circulated widely. News outlets updated their coverage. Headlines shifted from natural disaster to man-made flood. Public sympathy narrowed. Scrutiny intensified. The HOA attempted damage control through messaging, but trust had collapsed. Residents stopped listening. They focused instead on recovery, documentation, and accountability. I remained largely silent, cooperating with investigators when asked, providing records when requested. There was nothing to embellish. The truth was already clear. The valley where the dam once stood was quiet now, stripped bare, water flowing freely where restraint once existed. The absence felt heavy. It was not just a loss of structure, but a loss of balance. Environmental agencies weighed in next. They confirmed that the dam's removal altered downstream ecosystems. Sediment displacement, bank erosion, habitat disruption. Each impact carried regulatory consequences. The HOA's action had not just flooded homes. It had violated environmental protections. Fines were discussed. Restoration was ordered. The cost estimates were staggering. As the case expanded, the HOA's remaining leadership retreated further. Communication slowed. Transparency vanished. Decisions were deferred. The association functioned in name only, its role overtaken by attorneys and investigators. Residents formed their own committees, sharing information, coordinating legal efforts, supporting one another through cleanup and displacement. The community that had once been managed by rules now bonded through shared consequence. The dam became the center of every conversation, not as an object, but as a symbol. It represented stability ignored, authority overreached, and the price of acting without restraint. By the end of the month, formal complaints were filed at the state level. The HOA was named directly. Individual board members were named separately. The association's insurance carrier issued a reservation of rights, signaling potential denial of coverage for actions taken outside authority. That notice landed like a final blow. Without coverage, the HOA's exposure multiplied exponentially. The flood had taken homes. Now it was taking futures. The blame had found its target, and what followed would decide whether the HOA could survive what it had unleashed, or whether its own actions would wash it away entirely. The floodwater was gone, but the damage it left behind lingered in every conversation, every document, every unfinished repair. Streets reopened slowly, marked by stains that traced how high the water had climbed. Homes stood hollowed out, stripped to framing in places, their contents piled at the curb. The neighborhood smelled of disinfectant, wet wood, and something harder to name, betrayal. The HOA tried to regain control by acting busy. Emails went out promising updates. Committees were announced. Temporary task forces were formed. The language was careful, procedural, and hollow. Residents were no longer impressed by structure or tone. They wanted accountability, and they wanted it quickly. They did not get it. Instead, they got silence. Board members stopped answering questions directly. Requests for meeting minutes were delayed. Financial disclosures were postponed. When meetings did occur, they were tightly managed, cut short the moment discussion turned to responsibility. The HOA was no longer governing. It was protecting itself. That protection did not last. Attorneys representing homeowners began filing coordinated claims, not just for property damage, but for displacement costs, lost wages, emotional distress, and diminished property value. Each claim cited the same cause: unauthorized destruction of a water control structure. Each named the HOA as the responsible party. The association's legal counsel advised restraint, but restraint looked like avoidance to residents. Trust eroded further. People who had once defended the HOA now questioned every decision it had ever made. Insurance complications surfaced next. Homeowners learned that while their personal policies covered flood damage under certain conditions, insurers were reserving the right to recover costs from the responsible party. That meant lawsuits were not optional. They were inevitable. If insurers paid out, they would pursue the HOA aggressively. That reality set off panic inside the association. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Financial officers ran projections that worsened by the hour. The HOA's reserves, designed for landscaping and minor repairs, were nowhere near enough to handle mass liability. Special assessments were discussed, then abandoned after residents reacted with fury. They refused to pay for destruction they didn't authorize. The dam removal resurfaced in every argument. The board insisted it had acted in good faith. Residents responded with documents proving otherwise. Emails showed planning. Contractors confirmed direction. County reports confirmed causation. Good faith collapsed under evidence. Resignations followed. First, one board member stepped down, citing personal reasons. Then another. Then two more. Each departure created a vacuum, leaving fewer people willing to speak on behalf of the association. Those who remained looked exhausted, fearful, and increasingly isolated. The HOA's authority began to unravel. Rules went unenforced. Fines stopped being issued. Maintenance schedules slipped. Vendors hesitated to work without assurances of payment. The association that once issued demands with confidence now struggled to keep basic services running. County officials noticed. They issued notices requesting cooperation, documentation, and compliance. The HOA's responses were slow, incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Regulators escalated their involvement, no longer treating the association as a cooperative entity, but as a subject of investigation. Environmental agencies added pressure. They cited violations related to unauthorized alteration of a water control structure and downstream impact. Restoration requirements were outlined. Penalties were discussed. The HOA's problems multiplied beyond civil liability into regulatory exposure. The weight became unbearable. Residents began organizing independently. They formed committees to coordinate cleanup, legal strategy, and communication. They shared information openly, bypassing the HOA entirely. The association's role diminished by the day, replaced by collective action born of necessity. I watched this transformation for my property, the valley quiet now except for investigators and survey crews. The absence of the dam felt permanent, not just physically, but symbolically. It had been a point of balance. Its destruction had revealed how fragile assumed authority really was. The HOA tried one last time to assert control. They sent a notice reminding residents of their obligations under the bylaws. The response was immediate and brutal. Residents challenged the association's legitimacy. They questioned its authority to collect dues while under investigation. They demanded audits, elections, and resignations. The notice backfired. Within days, a petition circulated calling for a special meeting to dissolve the HOA or place it under external management. Signatures accumulated quickly. The association's leadership realized too late that power, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through paperwork. The legal reality closed in. Court dates were scheduled. Depositions requested. Board members were named individually in some filings. The association's insurance carrier issued a formal notice indicating coverage might be denied due to actions taken outside the scope of authority. That single letter changed everything. Without insurance, the HOA faced existential risk. Bankruptcy was discussed openly. Dissolution became a real possibility, not a strategy, but as survival. Residents no longer asked when repairs would finish. They asked whether the HOA would exist at all. The flood had done more than damage homes. It had stripped the association of its illusion of control. Every decision it made afterward was reactive, defensive, and too late. Authority does not survive exposure. The dam had held water back for decades without recognition. The HOA had assumed power for years without challenge. When both were tested, only one had been legitimate. The water proved it. The HOA began to drown not in floodwater, but in consequence. And the deeper it sank, the clearer one truth became. This story was no longer about a dam. It was about what happens when those who mistake authority for ownership finally meet the cost of that mistake. The next phase would not be decided by meetings or letters. It would be decided in court. The courthouse did not smell like justice. It smelled like paper, disinfectant, and waiting. Long before any judge heard the case, the HOA was already losing in places no ruling could reverse. Depositions began quietly, scheduled one by one, pulling board members into rooms where confidence evaporated under recorded questions and sworn truth. The first deposition lasted 6 hours. Emails were read aloud. Timelines reconstructed. Decisions dissected word by word. When asked why legal remedies were not pursued before physical action, there was no convincing answer. When asked why county officials were not consulted, silence followed. When asked to authorize the destruction of the dam, responsibility fractured instantly. Everyone pointed somewhere else. That fragmentation became the HOA's greatest weakness. Courts do not punish organizations. They punish decisions. And decisions require decision-makers. As testimony accumulated, a pattern emerged that no attorney could disguise. The board had acted deliberately, quickly, and without authority, believing enforcement power extended beyond law. It did not. Judges issued early rulings on procedural matters, and each one favored the plaintiffs. Motions to dismiss were denied. Requests to limit discovery failed. The HOA was ordered to produce full financial records, internal communications, and insurance correspondence. Transparency was no longer optional. The numbers shocked everyone. Reserves were nearly depleted. Legal fees were draining accounts weekly. Vendor contracts were frozen. Emergency assessments had been discussed internally but never implemented for fear of backlash. The HOA was operating on borrowed time, both financially and structurally. Residents learned this through filings, not newsletters. Trust collapsed completely. More lawsuits followed. Insurance companies joined as plaintiffs, seeking recovery for payouts already issued. Environmental agencies filed civil enforcement actions tied to the illegal removal of a regulated water control structure. The HOA was now defending itself on multiple fronts, each with separate consequences. The court consolidated cases where possible, but consolidation did not reduce exposure. It clarified it. The dam's destruction was ruled an unauthorized act. That finding alone unlocked liability pathways the HOA could not close. Expert witnesses testified next. Hydrologists explained how the dam moderated flow. Engineers confirmed it had been structurally sound. Environmental specialists detailed how its removal magnified flood velocity. Every explanation reinforced the same conclusion. The flood was predictable and preventable. That word echoed through filings, hearings, and media coverage. Preventable. Once that label attaches, sympathy disappears. Board members attempted to settle privately, but settlement requires money, and money requires stability. The HOA had neither. Plaintiffs rejected low offers. Insurers pressed harder. Regulators showed no interest in compromise. The association's insurance carrier issued its final determination. Coverage denied. The basis was simple. The dam's destruction fell outside the HOA's authority, violated law, and was not an insured risk. Defense costs were withdrawn. Indemnification was refused. The HOA was on its own. That letter sealed the outcome. Without insurance, the HOA's legal position collapsed overnight. Attorneys withdrew unless retainers were replenished. Financial officers admitted insolvency was imminent. The board called an emergency meeting that few residents attended, not out of apathy, but exhaustion. The vote that night was not about strategy. It was about survival. The HOA voted to file for bankruptcy protection. The filing halted some proceedings temporarily, but it did not erase responsibility. Courts lifted stays selectively, allowing environmental enforcement and personal liability claims to proceed. Bankruptcy protected accounts, not actions. Residents reacted with mixed emotion. Some felt relief that the HOA could no longer issue demands. Others felt anger that bankruptcy might limit recovery. Many simply felt tired. The neighborhood had spent months living inside consequences they never asked for. I followed the proceedings quietly, reading filings, attending hearings when required, speaking only when asked. The truth did not need narration. It was already written into transcripts. The valley where the dam once stood was now marked by survey stakes and restoration plans. Engineers discussed future mitigation, not replacement. No one suggested rebuilding the dam. That chapter was closed permanently. The court issued a critical ruling late in the summer. Individual board members could be held personally liable. That decision shifted everything. Resignations meant nothing now. Titles offered no shield. Authority did not absolve unlawful action. The people who voted, ordered, and executed the destruction faced consequences independent of the organization. Settlements followed quickly. Some board members reached agreements. Others fought and lost. Properties were sold. Assets liquidated. Futures changed quietly, one judgment at a time. The HOA as an institution faded. Its bankruptcy concluded with dissolution. Remaining funds were distributed under court supervision. Obligations transferred where possible. What remained was a legal shell, stripped of power, purpose, and presence. The neighborhood reorganized informally. Services were contracted directly. Rules were reduced to basic cooperation. No one wanted centralized authority again. The floodwater was long gone by then, but the damage it caused continued reshaping lives. The dam's destruction had unleashed more than water. It had unleashed accountability, one ruling at a time. Courts do not rush, but they do not forget. When the final judgment was entered, it did not feel triumphant. It felt final. The HOA had destroyed a dam over unpaid fees. The courts had destroyed the HOA over unlawful power. And between those two acts lay a lesson no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. The next chapter would not be about law or punishment. It would be about what remained after everything was stripped away. Because once the floodgates open, nothing returns to how it was before. When the legal filings slowed and the headlines disappeared, the neighborhood was left with something heavier than floodwater ever was. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows collapse, when people finally have time to process what they survived. Houses stood repaired but altered, their lower walls newer than the rest, their owners permanently changed by memory. The HOA no longer existed in any meaningful way. Its office was locked. Its website went dark. The sign at the entrance of the neighborhood was removed quietly one morning. loaded onto a flatbed without ceremony. No one protested. No one asked where it was going. The association that once governed daily life had dissolved into court records and archived emails. Life did not pause to mourn it. Instead, people adapted. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings before the flood now coordinated trash pickup, landscaping, and security themselves. Group chats replaced newsletters. Decisions were made through conversation instead of enforcement. It was slower, messier, but it felt honest. The flood had stripped away more than drywall and flooring. It had stripped away fear. Without fines, threats, or letters taped to doors, people interacted differently. Disputes still happened, but they were handled face-to-face. Compromise replaced compliance. The absence of imposed authority forced the community to learn cooperation the hard way. Insurance settlements continued for months. Some homeowners recovered most of their losses. Others did not. Legal fees consumed portions of payouts. Mold remediation dragged on. A few families chose to sell and leave, unwilling to stay in a place that carried too much memory. New buyers arrived cautiously. Disclosures were thorough. Conversations were honest. The story of the flood was told openly, not hidden. It became part of the neighborhood's identity, a warning embedded in property listings and casual conversation. Upstream, my land remained quiet. The valley where the dam once stood changed permanently. Without the structure, water flowed freely, reshaping the channel over time. It carved deeper paths, widened banks, and redistributed sediment downstream. Environmental agencies monitored the area regularly, documenting changes and guiding restoration where possible. No one suggested rebuilding the dam. That chapter was closed. The floodplain was reclassified. Buffer zones established. Certain areas were protected now, not as punishment, but as prevention. Nature had been given more space, and with it came a kind of stability that control had failed to provide. Sometimes I walked the edge of the valley and listened. The sound was different without the dam. Louder during rain, quieter in dry months. Less restrained, more honest. Water does not like being controlled indefinitely. It tolerates it only when respect is maintained. The HOA had not respected it. Neither had it respected boundaries of law or ownership. Those lessons echoed everywhere. County officials used the case as a training example. Environmental agencies referenced it in workshops. Developers adjusted plans elsewhere, quietly redrawing blueprints to avoid similar outcomes. The damage reached beyond one neighborhood. The people responsible faded into anonymity. Former board members resurfaced occasionally in records, settlements finalized quietly, names appearing briefly in public notices before disappearing again. No one chased them. No one celebrated their downfall. Accountability had already done its work. The community moved forward without ceremony. A volunteer committee eventually formed to handle shared maintenance. There were no titles, no badges, no authority to enforce anything. Just agreements written plainly, reviewed annually, and changed when necessary. Participation was optional. Respect was not. It worked better than anyone expected. The absence of centralized power removed incentives for abuse. No one wanted to recreate what had failed so completely. The flood was always there in memory, a reminder of how quickly control becomes catastrophe when unchecked. Children who were too young to remember the water grew up hearing about it secondhand. They learned which streets had flooded, which homes had been rebuilt twice, which areas were now protected. The story became local history, passed down casually, like a warning built into the landscape. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted not stopping the HOA sooner. I never answered directly. Regret implies choice between outcomes. There was no stopping them with words. They had already decided to act. The only thing that stopped them was consequence. The dam had held water. The law had held people accountable. Both had done their jobs, just at different times. As seasons passed, the land settled into its new pattern. Vegetation stabilized soil. Water found predictable paths again. Wildlife returned cautiously, then confidently. Nature, given time, corrected what force had broken. The neighborhood learned to live with uncertainty instead of control. Storms came and went without incident. Drainage systems were upgraded responsibly. Emergency plans were coordinated with actual authorities, not assumed ones. Preparedness replaced arrogance. The HOA had once claimed to protect property values. In its absence, values recovered anyway. Not because rules were enforced, but because trust returned. People looked out for each other now. They shared information. They paid attention to the land around them. They understood that stability came from respect, not dominance. The flood had been violent, sudden, unforgiving. But its aftermath was slow, deliberate, and instructive. It taught everyone involved that power exercised without understanding does not create order. It creates disaster. And once disaster exposes that truth, nothing built on illusion survives. The next chapter would not be about rebuilding structures or systems. It would be about the final reckoning, what the story ultimately meant. Once the water receded, the courts closed, and the people moved on. Because every flood leaves behind more than damage. It leaves behind clarity. And clarity is something no HOA can ever take away again. The final reckoning did not arrive in courtrooms or headlines. It arrived quietly, in moments when people realized what had truly been lost and what could never be rebuilt. Long after the lawsuit settled and the HOA dissolved into paperwork, the consequences continued to surface in subtler, more personal ways. Former board members carried the weight everywhere they went. Some moved away, unable to live among people who knew exactly what decisions they had made. Others stayed, withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, shrinking from conversations that once came easily. Authority had given them confidence once. Accountability stripped it away completely. Jobs were affected. Reputations followed. Background checks turned up court records and settlements. Professional doors closed without explanation. No one announced punishment. It simply happened, one opportunity at a time. The neighborhood felt the aftershocks differently. Residents who had once relied on enforcement learned to rely on awareness. They paid closer attention to drainage, soil movement, and weather patterns. Storm forecasts mattered now. Emergency plans were discussed openly. People no longer assumed someone else was in charge. That change ran deep. Without an HOA dictating rules, responsibility spread horizontally instead of vertically. When something felt wrong, people spoke up early. When maintenance was needed, it was coordinated transparently. Problems were addressed before they escalated, not after fines were issued. The flood had rewritten behavior. County officials continued monitoring the valley and downstream areas. Reports showed gradual stabilization. Erosion slowed. Sediment settled. Water paths became predictable again. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. The system had found equilibrium without artificial restraint. That outcome surprised many experts. The dam had worked, yes, but its destruction forced the land to adapt faster than expected. Given space and time, nature corrected itself enough to prevent repeat disaster. It wasn't control that saved the area in the end. It was respect. Developers nearby took note. Projects were redesigned with greater buffer zones. Drainage plans accounted for worst-case scenarios instead of best assumptions. Environmental consultants were involved earlier, not as formalities, but as safeguards. The story traveled quietly through professional circles. No one wanted to be the next cautionary example. The residents who stayed grew closer. Shared trauma has a way of stripping away superficial differences. People remembered who helped during evacuations, who offered storage space, who checked in when the power was out. Those memories mattered more than rules ever had. Children grew older with an understanding most adults never develop. They learned that land is not passive, that water is not obedient, that decisions have weight. School projects referenced the flood. Teachers used it as a lesson in cause and effect. The landscape itself became a classroom. Upstream, the valley continued its slow transformation. Native plants took hold where disturbed soil once lay bare. Birds nested in new growth. The sound of water changed with seasons, but no longer carried menace. It was louder sometimes, yes, but predictable. The fear had faded. I spent time there often, not out of attachment, but reflection. The dam had been part of my life for years, but its absence revealed something important. Structures solve problems until they become excuses for ignoring systems. The HOA had treated the dam as an obstacle instead of a safeguard. That mindset had cost them everything. People sometimes asked if I would ever rebuild it. I never said yes. Rebuilding would imply restoring what existed before, and before was not better. Before relied on assumption and unchecked authority. After relied on awareness and restraint. The difference mattered. The courts closed their files eventually. Final judgments were archived. The story slipped out of public view, replaced by newer conflicts elsewhere. But for those who lived through it, the reckoning never fully ended. It lived in how decisions were made. It lived in hesitation where arrogance once thrived. It lived in the silence before action. Former HOA supporters admitted, quietly, that they had trusted too easily. They had believed enforcement equaled safety. They had mistaken rules for wisdom. The flood corrected that misunderstanding permanently. Accountability does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives slowly, shaping lives over years instead of moments. The HOA had destroyed a dam over unpaid fees. But what they really destroyed was their claim to authority. That loss echoed far beyond fines and lawsuits. It redefined how an entire community understood power. The reckoning was not revenge. It was clarity. And clarity, once earned at such cost, tends to endure. Only one chapter remained, not about consequences, but meaning. Because every disaster leaves behind a question. What was all of this for? The answer waited in what the people chose to do next. In the end, it wasn't the floodwater that destroyed the HOA. It was what the water revealed. Once the streets dried and the walls were rebuilt, what remained was a clarity no rulebook could restore. People finally understood what power looked like when it was stripped of permission, and what authority became when it crossed into ownership it never had. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. There were no weekly violation notices, no threats of fines, no letters slid under doors. Instead, there were conversations, slow ones, sometimes uncomfortable ones. But they happened early, before problems hardened into conflicts. People learned to ask instead of demand, to explain instead of enforce. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. The absence of an HOA forced responsibility outward instead of upward. When drainage needed attention, residents met with county engineers directly. When maintenance was required, they coordinated as a group. When disagreements arose, they were handled in daylight, not behind letterhead. That change reshaped the culture. Before the flood, rules had replaced awareness. After the flood, awareness replaced rules. People noticed the land. They watched how water moved during storms. They paid attention to soil, slopes, and runoff paths. They stopped assuming someone else had thought it through. Because once someone had. And it nearly ruined everything. The valley upstream continued to heal. The channel widened naturally. Less violent now, more forgiving. Seasonal rains spread water, gradually instead of violently. Native grasses anchored soil. The ecosystem adjusted, not back to what it was, but into something stable enough to live with. Regulators reduced monitoring over time. Reports showed no further downstream risk. Emergency plans remained in place, but they were realistic now, grounded in actual geography instead of assumptions. The land was no longer treated as a problem to solve. It was treated as a system to respect. People who left the neighborhood rarely spoke about the HOA when they moved on. They spoke about the flood, about the day water came where it never should have been, about how fast certainty disappeared. Those stories followed them quietly, shaping how they viewed authority everywhere else. Those who stayed carried a different lesson. They learned that ownership is not just a legal concept. It's a responsibility to understand what you control and what you don't. The HOA had believed its reach extended wherever inconvenience existed. The flood corrected that belief with absolute finality. I thought often about the dam, not with anger, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. The dam had done its job faithfully, unnoticed, for decades. It didn't demand recognition. It didn't enforce compliance. It simply worked because it respected the system it existed within. The HOA had tried to replace that with authority. Authority failed where balance had succeeded. That realization stayed with me. Power, when it ignores context, becomes destructive. It doesn't matter whether it's exercised by a board, an institution, or a person convinced they're right. When power moves faster than understanding, it creates disasters that no apology can undo. The flood taught that lesson better than any court ruling ever could. Years later, visitors would sometimes ask why the neighborhood had no HOA sign at its entrance. Longtime residents would smile and say it used to. Then they would tell the story, not dramatically, not angrily, but honestly, about unpaid fees, about a dam, about water that refused to obey, and about what happened when someone mistook authority for ownership. The story always ended the same way, with the floodwater, with silence, with consequences. No one framed it as karma. No one needed to. Cause and effect were enough. The chain of events was clear. A decision was made without permission. Nature responded. The law followed. Power collapsed. What remained was choice. The choice to rebuild differently. The choice to listen before acting. The choice to understand that not everything exists to be controlled. In that way, the flood became more than a disaster. It became a boundary. A line drawn not by fences or bylaws, but by reality itself. And once crossed, it could never be ignored again. The HOA had destroyed a dam over unpaid fees. But what the water destroyed was far greater. It destroyed arrogance. It destroyed assumption. It destroyed the idea that authority can exist without limits. When the floodwater claimed the neighborhood, it didn't take homes forever. It didn't erase lives. It took something far more dangerous, unchecked power. And when that power washed away, what was left behind was something quieter, slower, and far more resilient. Awareness, respect, and the understanding that some forces don't answer to titles, threats, or letters. They answer only to balance. The water had made that clear. And once learned, it was a lesson no one would ever forget.